Welcome to Silent Screams, where the lines between the ordinary and the unexplainable blur, and the darkness holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. Tonight's story takes us to a place many of us know well, the open highway. But this is no ordinary road. This is where reality bends, shadows breathe, and the unimaginable thrives. Turn your lights low, settle into the stillness, and let's begin. The highway stretched endlessly under the inky black sky, its surface reflecting faint streaks of moonlight. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt echoed through the empty car. He wasn't supposed to be out here this late. He knew better. His parents had always warned him about driving alone at night, especially on this stretch of road. It wasn't the road itself that held the fear, it was the stories tied to it. Tales of travelers who never reached their destinations, of figures appearing in the rearview mirror, only to vanish when you turned to look. Michael had always laughed at these tales, brushing them off as urban legends designed to scare locals. But tonight, with the oppressive silence pressing in on him and the endless road ahead, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The first sign of trouble came subtly. The hum of the tires, a comforting white noise until now, began to falter. It wasn't mechanical, it was something else, something wrong. It sounded distant at first, like faint whispers brushing against the edges of his consciousness. Michael shook his head, dismissing it as the result of fatigue. He had been driving for hours, and his mind was bound to play tricks on him. But the whispers grew louder. They weren't coherent words, just fragmented sounds, overlapping and circling, like a distant crowd murmuring secrets they didn't want him to hear. He turned the radio on, hoping to drown them out, but the static that greeted him was worse. It crackled unnaturally, rising and falling, as if it were alive, syncing with the whispers in perfect, unnerving harmony. Michael turned it off and tried to focus on the road, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination. But then the lights flickered. The headlights dimmed momentarily before returning to full brightness. He frowned, glancing at the dashboard, but no warning lights appeared. Everything seemed fine, yet the unease in his gut told him otherwise. That's when he saw it. A figure on the side of the road, standing completely still. It was barely visible, shrouded in darkness and the faint glow of his headlights. At first, Michael thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he got closer, something about it didn't sit right. The figure didn't move, not to wave, not to step back from the road. It simply stood there, facing him. Michael's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the figure. Its face was obscured, but he could feel its gaze piercing through him, cold and unyielding. He pressed the accelerator, his instincts screaming to get away. As the car sped past, he resisted the urge to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what he might see. The road ahead was empty again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Michael's breathing was shallow, his chest tight as if the very act of existing in this space was suffocating. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, but the image of the figure burned in his mind. The way it stood so unnaturally still, the absence of any defining features, the oppressive feeling that lingered even after he had driven past, it wasn't normal. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The numbers flickered erratically before stabilizing, reading 2:06 a.m. That couldn't be right. He had checked the time less than 5 minutes ago, and it had been 1:47 a.m. His stomach churned as a cold realization washed over him. Time didn't feel normal here. The whispers, the figure, the flickering lights, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. As he reached for his phone to check the time, it buzzed in his hand, startling him. The screen lit up with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, just a series of zeros, and his thumb hesitated over the decline button. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Static greeted him at first, but then came the voice, low, raspy, and inhuman. "Why did you stop?" Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't stopped. He was still driving, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. His heart raced as he stammered, Who's this?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, and through it, he thought he could hear faint laughter, deep, guttural, and wrong. He hung up and threw the phone onto the passenger seat, his hands trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. Then, the temperature in the car dropped suddenly. The windows fogged over, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He reached for the heater, but it didn't respond. The buttons clicked uselessly under his fingers as a creeping frost began to edge across the windshield, obscuring his view. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as he slowed the car, squinting through the frost to see the road ahead. But there was nothing, just endless darkness. And then he saw them. Not one figure this time, but several, standing in the middle of the road. They were identical to the first, motionless, featureless, their heads tilted unnaturally as they faced him. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt just inches from the figures. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as he stared at them, frozen in place. The figures didn't move, but the oppressive feeling of their presence was unbearable, like a weight pressing down on his soul. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They came from everywhere, from the figures, from the car, from the very air around him. Michael clutched his head, his vision swimming as the world around him seemed to warp and twist. The road beneath him cracked and splintered, and the darkness seemed to seep into the cracks, spreading like a living thing. He closed his eyes, praying for it to stop, but when he opened them, the figures were gone. The road was empty again, but the frost remained, and the whispers lingered at the edge of his hearing, like a cruel reminder that this was far from over. Michael's grip on reality was slipping, and deep down, he knew the road wouldn't let him leave so easily. The road stretched before Michael like an endless ribbon of shadows, its surface cracked and distorted in the eerie frost-covered glow of his headlights. He gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands, his knuckles aching from the pressure. Every muscle in his body screamed to turn the car around, to flee from this cursed stretch of highway. But something deep inside told him it wouldn't matter. He wasn't sure how long he had been driving. Minutes? Hours? Time itself seemed to bend and twist out here, refusing to obey its usual laws. The dashboard clock had gone dark, its faint green glow extinguished along with any remaining sense of normalcy. The frost on the windshield had begun to retreat, but it left behind strange, intricate patterns, spirals, lines, and shapes that looked almost like writing. Michael couldn't bring himself to look too closely, afraid of what he might see if he stared too long. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the occasional crackle of frost under the tires. The whispers had faded into the background, but their absence was almost worse. He had grown used to their sinister presence, and now, without them, the air felt impossibly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the first thump. It was faint at first, like the sound of a pebble hitting the underside of the car. Michael jolted in his seat, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw only darkness. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound that seemed to drag along the length of the vehicle. Something was under the car. Michael's pulse quickened as he slowed to a crawl, his breath fogging up the interior. The thought of stopping terrified him, but the alternative, ignoring whatever was down there, felt even worse. He reached for the door handle, hesitating as his mind raced with possibilities. What if it was nothing? Just debris on the road, maybe an animal? But deep down, he knew better. Nothing about this place was ordinary. Summoning what little courage he had left, Michael turned off the engine, plunging the car into an oppressive silence. The headlights dimmed but remained on, casting a weak beam onto the cracked pavement ahead. The scraping sound had stopped, but now there was something else, a faint, wet gurgling noise, like water bubbling up from a clogged drain. He stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin. The flashlight on his phone flickered to life as he crouched low, peering under the vehicle. At first, he saw nothing, just the shadowy underside of the car and the frost-covered road beyond. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his breath caught in his throat. There, clinging to the chassis, was a hand. It was pale and skeletal, its skin stretched taut over knobby joints. Long, blackened nails scraped against the metal as it slowly pulled itself forward, revealing an arm, then a shoulder, then a head. Michael stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure was impossibly thin, its face sunken and eyeless, with a mouth that stretched too wide. It didn't move like a person, its limbs bent at unnatural angles as it crawled out from under the car, its head twisting to face him with a sickening crack. The gurgling noise grew louder as the creature let out a low, rattling breath, its mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. Michael couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His legs felt like they were made of lead as the creature slowly rose to its feet, towering over him despite its frail frame. Then, it spoke. "Why do you keep going?" the voice rasped, impossibly deep and hollow. Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air around it had turned toxic. "Turn back," it said, taking a shuddering step closer. "Turn back before it's too late." Michael stumbled toward the driver's side door, fumbling with the handle as the creature's words echoed in his mind. His instincts screamed at him to run, but where would he go? The road was endless, and the shadows offered no sanctuary. The engine roared to life as he slammed the door shut, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel. The creature stood motionless in the beam of the headlights, its eyeless face staring directly at him. Michael pressed the accelerator, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. He swerved around the figure, his breath catching as it disappeared into the darkness behind him. But the road didn't end. No matter how fast he drove, the scenery remained the same: twisted trees, cracked asphalt, and that suffocating darkness. The frost returned, creeping along the edges of the windshield like icy fingers. The whispers came back, louder now, almost frantic. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, fragmented and overlapping, spoken in voices he didn't recognize. "Keep going. Don't stop. Turn back." The conflicting messages made his head spin, his vision blurring as the road twisted and warped in front of him. The car felt smaller, the air inside growing colder with each passing second. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The creature was in the back seat. It sat perfectly still, its twisted limbs barely fitting in the confined space. Its eyeless face stared straight ahead, its mouth moving silently. Michael screamed, his hands gripping the wheel as he swerved violently. The car skidded, tires screeching as it spun out of control. He braced himself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the world outside the car seemed to shatter like glass, fragments of darkness falling away to reveal something else. The highway was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of gray, featureless and vast. The car rolled to a stop, its engine sputtering before falling silent. Michael sat in stunned silence, his hands still gripping the wheel. The whispers were gone. The frost had melted. But the creature, it was still there. It leaned forward, its bony fingers resting on the back of the driver's seat. Its breath was cold against his neck as it whispered, "You can't leave." "Not yet." Michael turned to face it, his body trembling with fear. But before he could speak, the world shifted again, and everything went black.